Hello, welcome everybody. I am Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Program here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. It's a great pleasure today to introduce Ian Proud, former British diplomat, to talk about his book, A Misfit in Moscow, How British Diplomacy in Russia Failed. Before I do so, I'd just like to flag a couple of upcoming webinars next week here at the Quincy. At 2 p.m, on Monday, the 17th, my colleague Andrew Weinstein will be chairing a panel on Iraq and the US, return to status quo or calm before the storm. Obviously of great interest given what's now happening in the Middle East. And on Tuesday the 18th, at this time, 12 EST, I will be chairing a webinar on the Ukraine Peace Summit in Geneva, which is happening this coming weekend, on its consequences, if any. I hope that some of you at least will be able to join us for that. Ian and I will talk for about half an hour, and then I will throw it open to questions from you, but I'll also probably pass them on as part of the discussion. Please put your questions in the Q&A, which you see at the bottom of the screen, and then I will pass on as many as I can, and I apologize in advance if I cannot get around to everybody. So with that, Ian, welcome. Just let me introduce you briefly. Ian Proud is a former British diplomat from 1999 to 2023. He organised the G8 summit in Northern Ireland in 2013, which was the last time that Vladimir Putin visited the United Kingdom. That, of course, was the year before the Maidan Revolution and the Russian annexation of Crimea. And from 2014 to 2019, Ian was stationed at the British Embassy in Moscow, where, amongst other things, he advised on sanctions policy, which we will, of course, be discussing. Ian was head of the Russian Crisis Committee, not, I think, a job which is ever likely to go out of fashion, alas. So, Ian, welcome. It's a great pleasure, I have to say, partly because of a strong sense of fellow feeling. I also regarded myself as a British misfit in Moscow. And I also did my best, not as a diplomat, but as a journalist, to try to, explain Russia to the British and try to maintain some kind of reasonable working relationship. So could you, just to begin with, could you briefly describe your book and tell us something about your time at the British Embassy in Moscow?
So, I mean, if I take it back to Northern Ireland, it was a really fascinating time to see kind of Putin on the lawn with David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. And at that time, the UK had a sort of functional, not always easy, but sort of functional relationship, with Russia. And I thought to myself, gosh, posting to Russia next year, because Russia was due to be the presidency of the G8 in 2014. I could go to 2 G8 summits in 2 years. What a cracking idea that is. So that kind of really stimulated my interest in having a posting in Moscow. And of course, between June of 2013 and my arrival in July of 2014, there was a run up to the Lithuania kind of summit. The Maidan protests, everything that happened, the annexation of Crimea, hostility in the Donbass, insurgency and so on, sanctions. And I arrived at a time when what we call the tier 3, kind of the harshest initial bunch of sanctions against Russia were imposed on the 31st of July in 2014. And that kind of, from having a sort of, not always easy, but sort of fairly constructive relationship, the imposition of sanctions and obviously the onset of the Ukraine crisis kind of set the tone, if you like, for 4.5 years of being a British diplomat in Moscow, constantly under the kind of scrutiny of the local intelligence services, having a difficulty sort of getting access to kind of real decision makers, in the Kremlin and other places, but also, and I think critically, actually trying to kind of, as you did previously as a journalist, try to educate UK ministers on what the Russians, were thinking, how we could sort of influence them in a context of a situation where the UK had stepped out of any ability to influence peace talks in Ukraine, having sort of sidestepped involvement in the Normandy format sort of back in in June of 2014. So, trying to educate the UK ministers that had become and were becoming increasingly kind of hawkish, in their policy towards Russia. And so sort of this sense of kind of, butting my heads up against both the Russian authorities, but also the British authorities in trying to make sense of, well, how can we have a better working relationship with Russia? And then, of course, in March 2018, the Salisbury nerve agent attack happened, and as a head of the crisis committee, I had to kind of piece together the embassy after we lost 76 colleagues in the space of a month, and which was possibly the saddest moment for me, the kind of lowest point. Not really seeing the diplomats chucked out, because I knew that the office would look after them, but seeing kids having to go home at 7 days' notice, and not sure where the schools, leaving their
of course
friends and all that sort of thing. So
you were on the board of the British American.
That's right. Well, in fact, I was shipped in to sort of keep it afloat, because the FSB was basically kind of manoeuvring to shut it, and I was shipped in to basically outsmart kind of the Russians in terms of gaming out, how we responded to that sort of tactical ambiguity. That I mean, could elaborate on that in more detail. But yeah, that was another one of my little side roles when I was out there. And of course, sadly, that school has now been closed recently as well, very sadly. So yeah, I mean, right through to kind of coming back to the UK and then having advised on sanctions and authorizing kind of sanctions against Russia, including sort of following the outbreak of war in Ukraine in February 2022.
Tell me, I mean, you arrived in 2013. Did your colleagues expect the kind of Russian reaction that we saw to the Maidan revolution, and in Crimea and in the Donbass?
Well, I arrived in 2014, but I was obviously following it as a Russian language student in 2013 after the summit, the G8 summit had finished. I think we, whether we expected it, I think we underestimated, the strength of Putin's response to what happened, after the kind of, the downfall of Yanukovych. Absolutely. I don't think, we thought that Putin would take such a bold and drastic step to, occupy Crimea. I mean, that wasn't in our thinking, and I think it took everybody sort of caught everybody off guard. Really, I think that's absolutely clear, and that partly informs our posture towards Russia ever since. It kind of there's the lack of trust that existed before 2014 was kind of deepened after kind of Putin's sudden lurch, in the direction of getting into Ukraine and taking their territory and all the consequences we see today.
But of course, it wasn't a sudden lurch. If one had been following Russian attitudes, statements, and I have to say, I mean, as a fellow Brit, I thought people might remember a little bit the Crimean War, no? To understand the importance of Sevastopol, emotionally as
absolutely,
well.
Absolutely. And of course, the Georgian War, much closer at home, 2008, which the build-up to which, was a not dissimilar, set of circumstances to that which kind of preceded, Russia's annexation of Crimea. So, no, if you look back in history, I mean, you shouldn't really be surprised, and certainly on the back of kind of, Obama's statements on red lines in Syria, I think sort of Putin did then and still today makes a play of him setting red lines and actually not allowing people to cross them. And I think that very much kind of played to his narrative of actually, we are tougher than the kind of feckless, liberals in the West, and if they cross our red lines, then we will act. So I think that his response in Crimea kind of played to that narrative too.
Mm. But I mean, does anyone in the Foreign Office read history these days?
I worry that they don't. I mean, unfortunately, two things. The modern generation of diplomats has very little kind of Russia knowledge and experience, and the body of experience that exists is that kind of core, kind of research core, if you like, who've been kicking around the block since the downfall of the Soviet Union, whose views on Russia are kind of shaped by that experience, that kind of, that sort of experience of seeing Russia emerge from this decaying sort of corrupted kind of Soviet system and being diminished by that experience. And that's the kind of knowledge base that we have in the Foreign Office. That there's no real kind of depth of knowledge of contemporary Russia, I don't think, and the way that we deploy diplomats, to Russia, where they can mostly sit inside the embassy building, they don't speak Russian because they haven't taken their exams, and actually that they spend most of the time kind of talking on secure video conferences to kind of policymakers, just exacerbates that, because diplomats exist to go out like journalists, right? To go out and actually meet ordinary people in the country where they operate, to kind of make sense of what they think, why they think the way they do, the kind of historical context to kind of the way that they are, and that just hasn't been happening for a very long time.
I have the strong impression that they're also very, very afraid of Russian women.
Well, of course, that's true. Yes, I mean, there's always a honey trap, and let's be honest. Some people, without going into detail, some people fell foul of that even while I was in Moscow, unfortunately. But there's a happily married man with 2 young kids that thankfully that was never a kind of fear that encroached on my daily life. But the honey trap risk, and we're told to kind of look in the ugly mirror every day. We'd go behind the secure doors of the chancellery, the kind of confidential area of the building, and the security officer would regularly remind us to kind of look in the ugly mirror, as a middle-aged men, that when gorgeous Svetlana is taking interest in us in Starbucks, she's not really interested in our looks. She's probably interested in the fact that we work for the British government and have access to kind of highly sensitive material.
But I mean, how about having dinner with other, with middle-aged or elderly, also not particularly beautiful male Russian think tank people, for example, or academics?
Well, I did. I mean, I did.
I know you did, but what about your
all
colleagues?
of the time? And made very good friends, and I'm still friends with people who are on the different side of the fence to me in terms of how they think. They're very much kind of pro-war, and I'm sort of very much against the war. So, but that sort of relationship building, which is another kind of core part of diplomatic statecraft, wasn't really there. People would go kind of set piece meetings at the foreign ministry, and the Russians would wheel out their standard lines, we'd wheel out our standard lines, but there's little on the kind of relationship building outside of kind of the confines of the formal day marching and the daily transaction of diplomatic business between the Russian government and our embassy, sadly.
Which is, I mean, a bit strange, given there is a very extensive think tank world by now, and perfectly open to discussions. And
absolutely, and on the economic side of things, there's a far more open and vibrant economic debate in Russia, arguably, than there is a political debate. You get the people like the Kudrins, the Cliffs, and these folk, and the people in the kind of the banking system, all these kind of think tanks who talk about economics and don't we liberalize and that sort of thing. Brilliant source of insight and thought leadership in terms of Russia's future. Some of which, interestingly, kind of Putin takes on board. Some which obviously he doesn't, because he's kind of craven to the Siloviki. But that kind of balancing act, I think, for Putin between the Siloviki and the kind of the Nabulinas, the Silovanovs, the kind of economic liberals, is a fascinating one to watch. Even today, where Nabulina and Silovanov are still, retain, a kind of really pivotal role in his state apparatus.
I mean, I think a good many people have been surprised, and of course in the West also disappointed, with the efficiency of the Russian response to sanctions.
Yes.
And they do seem to have some very able people, working on economic policy in the government. But were you surprised by just how, as it would appear so far, well, not just ineffective, but it would seem that in certain respects, sanctions have actually contributed to strengthening the Russian economy? You hear a lot of Russians saying they have forced us to do, I mean, basically to get out of what we used to call the Dutch disease and do all kinds of things that we should have done in the 1990s in terms of investing in. Do you think that is fair?
Yeah, no, I
as
do
far as
actually.
sanctions.
I mean, blessed are the cheesemakers. You know,
Yes.
when I arrived in Moscow, you know, so cheddar very quickly disappeared off the shelves after kind of Russia imposed its so-called kind of counter sanctions. And but that sprouted this enormous kind of artisan sort of cheese industry in Russia. And actually, all these kind of Soviet style kind of markets were refurbished and tarted up, and pop-up restaurants, you know, artisan cheese stalls in the space of 4 years. It's quite remarkable. But I mean, on the macro side of things, you know, I think sanctions, the important thing is that sanctions always had a kind of much smaller effect than bigger macro impacts, like the impact of the first oil price collapse in November 2014, the impact of the second oil price collapse in January 2016, the impact of COVID. You know, all of these things had a far bigger impact on the Russian economy than sanctions themselves. And the
Mm.
second point is that actually the kind of policymakers, certainly in London, weren't really interested anyway. I mean, sanctions were an end in themselves. They weren't really interested, and all the while they were just layering on more and more sanctions. Actually, kind of Russia increasingly was able to kind of brush them off and emerge, as you say, in some respects, kind of strengthened. In other respects, you could argue that it's kind of solidifying their dependence on mineral exports and that sort of thing, and setting back, you know, real kind of change in the economy. But yes, I mean, you know, that they have been in some regards strengthened by what's happened.
I mean, Russian liberals of my acquaintance are more worried that you will have a real ascendancy of the military industrial complex that will, you know, basically now re-embed itself in a quasi Soviet fashion, and that you'll never be able to escape it again.
Yes.
Because, of course, you have by now, I mean, as you could say in the US, I mean, huge popular constituency in the industrial areas of the country for military spending and military industries, and so far
Indeed.
they've done very well out of it, right?
Yeah, no, and you could say the same about the UK, where we've increased our commitments 2.5%. There's kind of bipartisan support for that, quite bizarrely within the election campaign. But yeah, I mean, I've been talking for some time about the re-Sovietization of Russia's economy. I mean, that really started back in 2015, you know, with the you know Rostec, you know, becoming a great big kind of conglomerate, military industrial kind of conglomerate. So it's been a kind of a gradual process and a kind of you know, the shifting balance of power between the Siloviki and the kind of liberals, you know, culminating in the kind of fantastic arrest of Ulyukayev, you know, when Sechin gave him that basket of sausage and wine with $2 million, you know, in notes in the bottom of it. So it's been a fascinating sort of it's been fascinating to watch kind of that shifting balance of power between the Siloviki uh, and the economic liberals. But I still, you know, feel hopeful by the fact that, you know, the liberals are still there. They still have a voice. They still clearly are influencing day-to-day economic, macroeconomic decision making in Russia in quite a positive way, albeit a way, of course, which you know, is enabling sort of Russia to continue its war in Ukraine quite successfully, with very little pressure on Putin, you know, or increasingly less pressure on Putin domestically, you know, around that particular campaign.
Do you see the appointment of Belousov as significant in that regard? A certain sector of Russians have place great hope in him as a force and what he represents as a force for the future. He, of course,
Yeah,
is he's a very skilled economist. He's not a liberal exactly, but he's not one of the Siloviki either. He has no stake, and he's supposed to be wholly uncorrupt, and he has no stake in the oil and gas and minerals industries.
yeah, and of course he was the key economic advisor in the presidential administration while I was there, you know, in Moscow. So he's very well regarded. And of course, you know, look at Shoigu.
Do you know him personally?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I used to go into the presidential administration sort of quite a bit. I wouldn't say, you know, we're close, but we've met. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Shoigu only. I mean, Shoigu's not a military person either. I mean, he only got there because of his role in kind of forming Edinia Russia, you know, in the early days. So he's not a military person either. I mean, my contacts in Russia very much see this as him being sent in to kind of sweep out kind of widespread corruption, within defence, particularly around the procurement and that sort of thing. Some people are interpreting it as kind of doubling down and getting ready for a long and protracted sort of war in Ukraine. But I see him as kind of going in a new broom, sweeping clean, as it were, particularly on the back of what happened last year with Prigozhin and his spat with Shoigu. I think Shoigu has increasingly kind of fallen out of favour, and corruption issues with the MOD have made his position untenable, it seems to me.
I don't know anyone who regrets, well, I don't know personally anyone who regrets Shoigu's departure in Russia.
Well, no.
Though
But
that-
interestingly, like Medvedev, he's loyal to Putin, so that's why he's been able to hang around so long, and he's been booted upstairs into a non-job like Medvedev, was after he was kind of, his scandals around corruption that were revealed by Navalny became so great that Putin had to sort of clean out and get Mishustin in.
I mean, in the middle of your service, of course, you had Brexit, Britain leaving the European Union.
Yes.
How did that affect your work and policy towards Russia, or if it did?
Well, of course, we didn't actually. I mean, the vote happened, while I was there. It certainly had a demotivating effect on the Chancellery, because diplomats, not all of them, but by and large, tend to be kind of more internationalist, and more kind of pro-European, therefore, in focus and outlook. But it's a bit of a non-event in terms of the Russian news and in terms of the things that we wanted to discuss with the Russian kind of policymakers anyway. So it had remarkably little impact on my work. When it had an impact was actually after I came back, when we had to take all EU sanctions into UK sanctions under UK kind of law as part of this kind of big drive. So when I got back, I must have authorized almost half of all of the sanctions that the UK took on when taking them over directly from EU law. So that's the only, for me personally, that's the only kind of influence for me. It was remarkable as a non-event, and in any case, given that the sort of discussions on peace process in Ukraine are very much driven by the Germans and the French anyway, within the Normandy format. We'd been excluded from that since the summer of 2014, 2 years before the Brexit debate. I mean, we had no influence on that process before Brexit. After Brexit, we still had no influence on that process. So nothing really kind of changed in terms of our ability to influence European kind of policy thinking on sort of the Ukraine crisis, after that vote.
So what did we talk to the Russians about from 2014 to
Very good question.
Mm.
We got very little access. I mean, I got better access on the economic side, but we couldn't talk about Ukraine because the Russians just saw us as totally irrelevant, on that. We wanted to, but couldn't really talk on Syria, which was our other kind of big foreign policy priority, because again, the Russians saw us as, particularly after the kind of Westminster, vote where Parliament voted against the UK military involvement in Syria. From that point on, Russia saw us as totally bit part players, in Syria. So the Turks, the Americans are always kind of bigger. So we talked about Libya, some Middle Eastern, DPRK, North Korea and stuff, and all these things. But in terms of the issues that mattered, Ukraine, Syria, we were pretty voiceless, I have to say. Even though we kind of kept pushing on that door. I mean, actually, the Syria door, we'd stopped pushing on the Ukraine door from the back end of 2014, I feel.
I mean, on Syria, I have to say, my Russian acquaintances, including, I suppose, what you'd call maybe statist liberals or patriotic liberals, or actually just a good many analysts in general, they honestly could not understand our policy towards Syria. I mean, especially after what happened in Iraq and then Libya, that they would ask me, how could you set out to destroy another Middle Eastern state without having any idea what will follow? I mean, how can you do this? Do you not understand the obvious danger that ISIS it can take over? And
well, indeed, yeah. And the massive migration crisis that swept over Europe.
But how did British diplomats respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think we responded to situation in Ukraine, an absolute kind of moral sort of a sense of moral righteousness that actually, because
But
we
Ukraine,
despise.
but Ukraine, I can understand. But in the Middle East, there ought to be less room for, given everything that's happened over the years, for righteousness, shouldn't
Yeah,
there?
I know, but unfortunately, righteousness is a very is a very strong sort of guiding influence in terms of how our foreign policy moves in the UK. Certainly under the Conservative government, and actually also a tendency just to kind of align ourselves too closely at times with chaotic US foreign policy as well, I fear.
Well, I mean, that brings me to an obvious question, which I'm sure you heard from the Americans, sorry, from the Russians, which is, I mean, is there in fact British foreign policy anymore, or is it made in Washington in all serious matters?
Well, my personal view is it's increasingly kind of we increasingly kind of follow the American line. So some would interpret that as meaning it's made in Washington. I mean, we had a policy when we were within the European Union as a common foreign and security policy. Okay, it's very consensual in its orientation, but nevertheless, within that sort of framework of 28 states, the UK was a very, very powerful voice. Within the EU, we were a very powerful voice in imposing sort of sanctions against Russia at the start of the Ukraine crisis. Within the EU, we, had a sort of important role in the JCPOA, when that was going in as a positive direction on Iran, for example. So, within the EU framework, actually, the UK had quite a sort of powerful voice in shaping, foreign policy. We don't have that now because the Americans will do what the Americans will do, and we'll like it or lump it, and more often than not, we're lumping it. So I fear, yes, that influence is going, and it doesn't really even relate to any particular association or with a particular party, whether it's Democrat or Republican in the US, whoever's in charge, in the US, and we just kind of tend to follow the lead.
I have noticed a tendency now uh, on the Conservative side, but perhaps on the Labour side as well, for a much closer party identification among some British politicians. And I was reading the Daily Telegraph recently. In the past, there was more of a feeling that the Democrats and the Republicans are American parties with, with very specific American character and don't really, influence British domestic policy. But now there seems to be a tendency among the Tories to feel that you actually have to identify with the Republicans, which now, of course, means identifying with Donald Trump, and perhaps a natural reaction against that on the left in Britain.
Yeah, I don't know that I really see that, given how closely we're associating ourselves with Biden's policy on Ukraine, for example. So I don't really see that.
I wasn't talking about the
there are
establishment. Yeah.
there are some figures in the right that kind of would intuitively kind of probably prefer Donald Trump, but in terms of the facts of our foreign policy, we are in complete lockstep. Conservative government is in complete lockstep with the Democrat government on policy in Ukraine, and when Obama was in power, David Cameron was closely aligned with him. When Bush was in power, Tony Blair from the Labour Party was very, closely aligned. In fact, Tony Blair actually wrote to Jack Straw, shortly after 9/11, saying that the UK's number one foreign policy priority was being close to the USA. I mean, how is that even a foreign policy priority? But there you go. I mean, that's what Tony Blair wrote. So I don't see it. I mean, maybe in the bars of Westminster, people talk about these things, but in terms of the facts of foreign policy, you can't really kind of make that argument, I don't think.
So, what does happen if Trump wins in November, as far as British policy is concerned?
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Panic?
I mean, we have the famous and rather cringy moment of Theresa May walking hand in hand with him through the kind of the White House, garden. I think we'll just deal with him as we sort of dealt with him before, and whoever's going to be the US ambassador hopefully will be less or more discreet than Kim Darroch. If it's Tim Barrow, I'm sure he most certainly would be, because Tim Bauer is a sort of character who would be much more discreet in his reporting on Donald Trump. But as it relates to kind of Ukraine and Russia, I think I mean Trump's position on that is quite clear. He would want to see an end to the war, and what that basically means is stepping away from complete and unconditional support for Zelensky and actually encouraging him to put his suit back on and sit at the negotiating table, which is really the only thing that's going to change the status quo on the battlefield.
Well, yes, but I mean, that surely is the whole thing. I mean, Britain having taken such a hard line on Ukraine, and yet at the same time being so deferential to the United States. I mean, what if the United States does a virtual U-turn under Trump and adopts a completely different policy? Where does Britain stand then?
Well, we'll just be kind of left flailing. But I mean, we had this, if you remember, back in halfway through my time in Moscow. I mean, Donald Trump came into power halfway through, my time in Moscow. And we were kind of left flailing. Then prior to that, the Americans lobbied us constantly not to have economic engagement, with Russia. Trump come in, that completely changed. Philip Hammond cut off all direct ministerial engagement with between the UK and Russia. Donald Trump came in, had his Helsinki summit with Putin. So we were just kind of left flapping around and ultimately sort of coming back into an equilibrium with whatever the Americans are doing. It seems to me.
So you wouldn't expect Britain actually to oppose a Trump peace policy if such a thing
No,
is.
I don't see how we could, because I think if Trump were to do that, the Europeans would be more inclined to come on board, like Scholz and Macron or whoever. If Macron's still around, who knows at that time? But I think if the Europeans come on board, that leaves us in no man's land, or leaves us, should I say, still in no man's land on policy as we have been before. So we'd have to sort of come on board. I mean, I think the Poles, the Balts would kind of oppose that, but I think if France and Germany were to kind of support that, then we'd either have to kind of stick or just move. And I think we'll ultimately probably have to move. And one of the interesting things for me at the moment is, with the Labour Party at the moment not having a foreign policy, not having a stated foreign policy, because it doesn't want to kind of appear to have a point of difference from the Conservatives in the run-up to a general election that's expected to win. The interesting thing for me will be actually how they kind of spin that, because we will probably have a different colour of government in the UK, when and if Trump were to come to power. So I think that would be actually quite significant. And I think that they would probably have more scope to kind of flex their position than the Tories do now, where they're totally entrenched.
I mean, following on from that, we have a question from the floor. What is the issue, or I suppose, is there an issue on which the UK, I'm sorry, could most conceivably choose to follow an even slightly more independent foreign policy than they have recently? I mean, where do we have still a measure of autonomy? If we do.
Well, I mean, the purpose of Brexit was actually to kind of gain greater control of our lives in terms of foreign policy, but also kind of trade policy. And on trade policy, it's been a bit of a failure, because actually all the kind of promised free trade agreements haven't kind of really materialized, and we've kind of gone nowhere without our sort of Russia policy has gone into decline, or influence from an already very low base has kind of sunk still further. Where do we have influence in the world now? I mean, I think we're a country that has declining power because of a self-isolation that we've imposed on ourselves through Brexit. But that's just my personal view as a pro-European internationalist. So we're in good question. Maybe in some of the overseas territories, maybe in Tristan da Cunha, influence has grown. Who knows? But I don't see any kind of major. If you look at Israel, Gaza, we have no influence there. I mean, ultimately, kind of the Israelis will take their guidance from where the US are positioning themselves, on that. DPRK, we don't know, nor did we ever really have much influence on that anyway. China, we're only in AUKUS because we're sort of aligning with kind of the US on that. In Latin America and Africa, I mean, the Russians and the Chinese now have increasing influence, there far more than we do. So yes, very good question. I wish I knew.
So do I. I mean, one incident which inevitably we have a question from the floor about, where Britain is seen widely to have played an important role, was when Boris Johnson allegedly, well, no, we know that he did, we don't know how important it was, strongly discouraged the Ukrainians from seeking a peace settlement with Russia. That, of course, was in March of 2022. That was, after you'd left Moscow. But do you think that was as important as some people say? And was that very much a Boris thing, or did that reflect a consensus in the British foreign and security establishment?
Well, let's just be completely clear that the consensus in the British foreign and security establishment is hawkish on Russia, and has been, or had been for the 8 years and longer, kind of preceding that, arguably for 14, 15 years, preceding the outbreak of war in Ukraine. So, Boris wasn't swimming against the tide, in that respect. What he was doing was channeling his inner Churchillian and wanting to be seen as some sort of big savior of Ukraine, a big brother. We're going to help you, and you should keep fighting to the last Ukrainian. And actually, just a few weeks later, Liz Truss was stood up in Mansion House, making a speech encouraging Ukraine not only to reclaim the land that it had lost after the war started in February 2022, but actually to aim to take back, its borders right back to sort of, February 2014 as well, retaking Crimea. A completely irresponsible kind of shift, and actually sort of encouraging Ukraine in this endeavor and promising something that we couldn't really deliver, which is support for as long as it takes. And as we've seen since the war started, actually kind of support, military support for Ukraine has been dwindling, and actually that there are big question marks about how long the West will continue to sustain this kind of massive investment of cash and material to kind of pop up a war, which could, at least in ceasefire terms, be ended fairly quickly, it seems.
And well, I suppose two questions there. One is that, of course, if there had been a real chance of Ukraine retaking Crimea with Western support, that would appear to be the swiftest path, actually, towards the use of nuclear weapons and Armageddon. Was that, once again, do people actually understand the stake that Russia has in Crimea, or not?
I don't think they do, or if they do, they don't really care. And there's kind of they're willful and oblivious to the risks of nuclear escalation. And a good example of that is the annexation of the two additional oblasts in Ukraine since the war started. I think one of the reasons that actually Russia legally, illegally in my view, but legally in their view, so claimed those oblasts as their own, was to give it the justification to its own sort of domestic constituency to use nuclear weapons in those places, should there be some incursions by Ukraine or NATO back to the Ukrainian forces to reclaim them. So the whole point of that was to give them a legal justification to use nuclear weapons. And if we don't understand that, then I think actually it's incredibly dangerous for European security to kind of keep pushing this idea that there can be some sort of conventional military victory when very clearly there can't be.
Yeah, no, exactly. And what also frustrates me very deeply is that I'm sure you as well, is that there is a conflation of trying to work for a compromise peace, which all the military, economic, demographic, political indicators suggest, will be inevitable at some stage, whether through just running into the sand or possibly a formal agreement. The conflation of that somehow with the idea that one is supporting the war. You oppose the invasion, I oppose the invasion. We all thought it was a crime and a terrible idea, but that's, now the question is how the hell to get out of it, right?
Well, nobody's putting up a credible alternative to peace. And as I often say, actually, we're stuck in this kind of no man's land between war or peace, to riff off kind of Leo Tolstoy. We've never wanted war with Russia. We've avoided NATO, that is, having a direct kind of conventional war with Russia, but we haven't wanted peace either. We have to choose: do we want peace or do we want war? I mean, this horrible no man's land in which it's only really the Ukrainians and actually arguably the Russians that are suffering is nobody's winning. Nobody's winning in this situation at all. So we have to either fight with Ukraine or preferably actually help Ukraine to make peace.
But I mean, that goes back to the whole question of NATO membership for Ukraine, because I mean, it was always evident that we never had any intention of fighting to defend Ukraine. And yet, as many people warned, I mean, to take Ukraine into NATO or offer to do so with the eventual prospect of Russian expulsion from Sevastopol. Well, I mean, you must have been warned about that.
While meanwhile fast tracking Sweden and Finland into NATO after the wars had started, and nobody thinking that that doesn't look even slightly duplicitous. Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, it's a totally kind of unsustainable kind of proposition that the Ukraine should join NATO, and this. I mean, this is a red line that the Russians have been setting for a very long time now. So the Ukrainian membership of NATO, going right back to kind of 2008. Really, and it hasn't changed. And while I was in Moscow, we had this John Simpson, the BBC kind of veteran journalist, had this really telling interview with Peskov, and you can still look at it online. I encourage people to do so and just watch it. The Simpson Peskov interview on BBC from about November 2014. Peskov's lines to this day haven't changed. About sort of NATO expansion. And yet we keep ignoring, this with the results, sadly, that we see today. At some point, we need to kind of there needs to be a final reckoning on actually, Ukraine's kind of future in terms of its NATO aspirations, and so on. And I think my personal view is we should be taking that off the table, while at the same time thinking about appropriate security assurances that we can give Ukraine to prevent this happening in the future. Both of which, by the way, were in this proposed, a peace deal at Istanbul.
I mean, it often struck me that I was part of many such conversations, and I was reading an off-the-cuff comment by Sir Laurie Bristow, who was ambassador before your time, right?
No, he was while I was there. Yes.
Oh yeah. Well, he said somebody from a Russian think tank, I think I know who it is, said to him back in whenever it was, look, you do realize that NATO membership for Ukraine will mean war. And Bristow says, I just laughed at it. I said, what are you talking about? War, how ridiculous. And so why didn't we listen? I mean, I was brought up to think that was the job of both diplomats and, as I was, journalists, to listen. And yet with Russia, there seems to have been simply a willful refusal to listen.
Yeah, there has been a willful refusal to listen. And that in a way goes back to this kind of culture of the Foreign Office, where most of our Russia experts are kind of old sweats from the 1990s, who still think of Russia as this kind of depleted, diminished state that emerged out of the decay and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that actually, if push comes to the shove, they'll back down. And of course, they won't. And everything about Russia now, about Russian history, tells us that they won't. And yet we still, blindly kind of stumble forward and hold Ukraine gently by the hand and lead them into calamity.
Is there a deeper problem there from several questions about this from the floor, from the Cold War, or for that matter, from the 19th century, in terms of particular attitudes to Russia, rather than, as opposed, for example, to attitudes to China or wherever? I was always struck by the fact that I had rather expected after the end of the Cold War that Britain having lost an empire. And of course, although we mostly managed to scuttle away before the real disasters happened, the end of the British Empire was an extremely messy and nasty affair in India in
Well, indeed.
1947, in
Yeah.
Nigeria. Well, actually, I'm still, with
Well,
us in
India is another great example of a country where we think we have far more influence than we actually have.
yes, yes. But is there a particular pathology with regard to Russia?
I think there's a very particular. I don't like to use Russophobic, but that's the the only convenient, I suppose, term to use. View towards Russia that there's, unlike in the US, it's fascinating. Unlike in the US, where there's genuinely kind of open debate about, well, should we have a different approach on Russia Ukraine. There's no debate in the UK. There's this bizarre sort of bipartisan Tory and Labour support for what we're doing. Maybe that will change after the Labour Party becomes, the new government. But the press, it's almost impossible to kind of take a view that differs from the government's view on our policy. It's almost like we are Russia. And actually, somebody once said that actually the problem with the UK and Russia is that we're too similar in terms of our kind of mindset. So maybe that's it. But it kind of feels like very propaganda very much drives the thinking. And actually, ordinary people in the UK have very little knowledge of what's happening in Russia, about Russian people, about Russian history, and then they just live off this kind of endless drip feed of propaganda from both the Tories and the Labour Party. Let's say the Labour Party, but their message doesn't differ. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I know. Well, thank you for the plug for the broader US debate. That is, of course, why I'm speaking to you from Washington.
Well, indeed. Well, I mean, it's amazing, that there is genuinely more open debate, in the traditional and alternative media and in the think tank world, and that's good. You need that kind of pluralism, right? We don't have it in the UK.
Oh, indeed. Very, very, very depressing. Um, the America, suffers from the change of parties, and then everybody reversing what the previous administration did. How damaging was of course, with it under the same party, but the extraordinary. How many foreign secretaries were there while you were?
8. Well, I mean, now it's 8 with Cameron, but.
Did that have did that have a really disruptive?
No, it had. It's actually the other way around. It had no impact, because what Trump would call the swamp, the swamp effect. The bureaucracy, really kind of drives policy makers, policy kind of thinking on Russia. So, any new temporary kind of foreign secretary we get in would have, the foreign office, the intelligence agencies, the MOD briefing their new ministers, on how they should think, and most of the time they just, follow along. I mean, interestingly, Jeremy Hunt, his foreign secretary, he showed signs of actually wanting to kind of think, more laterally about our approach to Russia, but every attached to a lame duck prime minister in Theresa May and basically ignored him. They just waited for him to leave, and of course, inevitably, he did leave. So actually, the bureaucracy, that's the secureocracy is so powerful in Russia that it doesn't really matter if ministers come and go.
A question: you mentioned the interview with between John Simpson and Peskov.
Yeah.
When was that?
It was in November 2014.
Oh, okay. A question: the increasing closeness of Russia and China, although, of course, one should never, so far at least, call it an alliance. It's not an alliance, but it's certainly a much closer partnership. Was this predicted when you were in the Foreign Office, that they would draw closer and closer together? Because there was a lot of course, skepticism about it. Oh no, the Russians are much too scared of the Chinese. They don't have anything to offer each other. But it seems they do.
We definitely thought about it. In fact, I was sent off to Beijing and Manchuria to kind of do some thinking on it quite early on. in my time in Moscow. So yeah, there's thinking. I wouldn't say there's necessarily kind of extensive thinking about it, but I think my sense has always been, for many years now, actually, that the depth of the relationship is easy to exaggerate. Now, clearly, Russia is shifting its focus east on the back of an almost complete severing of its, relationship with countries in the West, but it's doing so on the basis of quite an unequal partnership with China. It's a country that is 10 times smaller than China, both demographically and economically. It has much deeper, more so historic, if you like, sort of relations with India, which has a kind of quite a difficult relationship with China. China is increasingly kind of replacing Russian influence in Central Asia with a flood of investment money through the Belt and Road Initiative in trade. And so, actually, for me, I think it's easy to exaggerate the depth of the kind of the Sino kind of Russian relationship. I mean, it's important for Putin to kind of have a stable and strong relationship with Xi, obviously. But I think for him, BRICS is as important as kind of balancing, you know, for him to kind of balance Indian influence, Chinese influence, but also have these kind of really good conversations with the global South as part of this drive to the multipolar world, on which obviously kind of the Russians and the Chinese in particular are very closely aligned.
Yes, yeah. The Russian reach out to the global South, and of course that has been greatly assisted by what's happened in Gaza, in
Well,
terms of
indeed.
moral. I wouldn't say. I mean, not so much moral equivalence as I mean, there is simply a widespread view that the West is morally bankrupt, I would say, by now,
Yes.
as a
No,
result of what
absolutely.
happened. One question, just how rigorous were the Russian language requirements for British diplomats? You suggested, I think, that they most more or less evaded them.
Well, it's C1 is the requirement. It's like a bachelor's degree level, and actually you have the option to go up to kind of master's degree level in the language. And actually, most of the kind of political type outward facing sort of diplomats, or everybody's expected to kind of hit that standard. And while I was there, kind of very few did, and I understand that very few do even even today. Since I've left, and but language is a vital part of the toolkit of being a diplomat, to get out and just talk to ordinary people. I mean, if you're in Moscow, I mean, it's fine. You'll easily find people who want to talk to you in English, including when you're meeting bankers, think tankers, and go to universities and that sort of stuff. But if you get out of Moscow, get out to the Urals, get out to Siberia and that sort of thing, you won't. And actually, if you want to kind of get real conversation going, you need it. But it's C1, C2 is the kind of level that we aspire to.
I mean, I wondered, I mean, something that I certainly saw in the 1990s, and I've seen in other parts of the world, I don't know how true it was in your time, was that, insofar as British diplomats did socialize and go out and actually form friendships and not so much talk to people, but listen to people, it tended to be a very self-selected group of westernizing Russian liberals who would then act in effect as a kind of echo chamber, or as I've sometimes called it,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
copulation illusions, um, confirming Western diplomats in their views of Russia, but not, of course,
yes,
actually representing the vast majority of Russians, let alone the Russian government or
yeah. No,
South.
absolutely. I think that's right. And of course, lots of modern diplomats would just go for meetings with other diplomats as well, from the American embassy, from the European embassies, not from the Chinese embassy. But for me, I didn't. I took the opposite approach. I tended to end up getting to know people who were not, echo chamber the Western liberals. I had a good friend in Gazprom, who used to be a Soviet diplomat back in the day, and was very firmly aligned with kind of the Kremlin policy. A good friend at the university, same thing. Yeah, had a great big carpet of Medvedev on it on the wall of his office, which said very clearly and colourfully, where he stood. I went to a local park run group, and it's all kind of middle class, working class people going out for 5K run every Saturday morning, and that was really interesting. And of course, they welcomed me in. We talked about running and all that sort of stuff, and yeah, so. but that's what you kind of have to do, and sadly, too few people do that.
We're kind of fairly close to the end. One question I have to say, in my case, the answer would be none whatsoever. But question: while you were stationed in Moscow, did you feel that any of your work had actually had a positive influence on the British government?
Well, I think I have to say that none of it had a positive influence on UK foreign policy, because we see it hasn't changed as soon as Philip Hammond came into power. So no, but in terms of actually making real contacts that I'm still in touch with on both sides of the fence, for me at a personal level, it did. I mean, I made good friends who I'm still in touch with, but in the big scheme, sadly, I hate to admit that I was a complete failure in that regard.
True of my time as a journalist and commentator, of course, as well. Well, that brings me, I suppose, to the final question, which is obviously completely hypothetical and speculative and maybe utopian, but can you see circumstances in which there could be an actual measure of reconciliation or détente between Britain and Russia in the future?
Well, I think it has to start with an ending of the hostilities in Ukraine. There has to be a ceasefire, and then, sadly, I think what's going to happen is it's going to be a very long, decades-long kind of peace process. It's just going to be like Nagorno-Karabakh, really all over again. And while that's going on, there'll be a kind of slow normalization, I think, of kind of European sort of Russian relations. And I think inevitably we'll follow the pack. I don't think we'll lead it. I think we'll be at the back of the pack. But I think we'll drift in that direction. But I mean that assumes that there'll be some sort of we won't all be immolated by nuclear war before then, of course. And let's hope that doesn't happen. But yeah,
I mean, one final question on that score, which I have to say a lot of Russians have asked me, is in the British foreign security establishment, all these statements about a coming war with Russia and about a Russian attack, a deliberate attack on NATO, not us stumbling into war, but a deliberate attack on Poland or the Baltic states. Do they actually believe this? Is this sincere, or is this that people do think that we need to spend more on the military? And of course, this isn't just Britain, it's across Europe, that a measure of rearmament is necessary. And the only way to bring this about is to, given budgetary constraints and economic situation, is to scare the hell out of people. Or is this fear real? Because the Russians say, look, this is madness. Why on earth would we attack NATO? Everything we're doing is to try to stop NATO intervening in Ukraine. What do you think?
I mean, it's completely baseless. I've seen absolutely no evidence that Russia has either the desire, nor more importantly, the capability to kind of do that. I mean, NATO is more than 10 times bigger, than Russia. Even the European bit of NATO spends more than 4 times more than Russia, on defense. It's complete scaremongering. And I think the irony for me is actually, NATO for me is just like the EU. It's this kind of undemocratic kind of bureaucracy that needs to exist, that needs to kind of accrete power, that needs to justify its existence. So all this kind of nonsense about spending more on defense is just to support its own sort of undemocratic existence, in my view. But I mean, if you look at the 2%, for example, commitment, I think 17 NATO countries don't currently hit the 2%. If they did, I mean, that alone would add $81 billion a year alone to kind of NATO defense spending, which is almost as much as kind of Russia spends in 1 year now. So that we don't. I mean, how much more than Russia do we need to spend on defense? Not to reassure ourselves that it's not about to invade Latvia, which it has absolutely no intention of doing, from my perspective.
And of course, it would be different if we actually planned to fight in Ukraine. But as I always say, you could conscript every German from the age of 18 to 40 into the German military, and they still wouldn't go to fight in Ukraine. So
yeah. Well, let's hope they don't do that.
Let's hope they don't do that. Indeed, indeed, they did that once, and it did not turn out terribly well for anybody.
Yes.
Well, Ian, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I urge everybody to buy the book, which I have to say is both extremely insightful and interesting, but also highly amusing. It's a very good read.
Thank you very
so thank
kindly.
you, Ian. And I apologise to anybody in the audience who couldn't get to the question, because obviously time was limited. So thank you, and I hope that some of you will be able to turn up to our 2 webinars next week.
Thanks,
Thank you
Anatol.
again.
All the best.